This tutorial will go through the stretched volumes assignment for 3 Plus Studio and talk about generating the geometries and making some slight adjustments to the Grasshopper script that you were given. So you all are starting with 3 simple volumes in Rhino, as well as a point that sets a reference plane. I have these things organized. Layer management is going to be really critical, as always, in Rhino and Grasshopper. So I have these volumes put on a layer called boxes. You can call it whatever you want as long as it's on its own layer. And then I have both the surface perforations and the convex enclosure scripts that you were given open. I'm going to start with the convex enclosure. I think you guys have been through this in class, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on how it's set up. But I'm going to set my 3 volumes, selecting those, right-clicking on this brep, and setting multiple breps, and then choosing my point, which is just located at the bottom plane per the instructions on the script, and set one point. And this provides a base reference plane. At the end of the script then, if I scroll to the end, I should have a series of lines. The reason they weren't showing up is that I had my Grasshopper geometry turned off. I didn't have it visible. And so that's kind of where the script ends. It takes the outside corners of all of the volumes and stretches a surface around them, basically making sure that it's convex and not concave. So what you need to do is bake these lines into Rhino so that you can start creating planes from them. So by selecting the cull command, which is the last in the series, and right-clicking on it, you want to bake into Rhino. I've already set up a layer for these outlines called outlines, so I'm going to bake it onto that layer, and then just hide Grasshopper for now. In Rhino, the next thing I need to do, oh, actually, the other thing I want to do in Grasshopper before I close it is hide the geometry so that I don't see those little white X's where the corners are. So now I'm going to turn off my boxes, and I need to make planes in the locations where these lines are. Excuse me. So I'm going to activate a layer that I have already set up called planes. And using the surface from 3 or 4 corner points command, I'm going to go through and start drawing these planes in manually. And so your Grasshopper script is going to do a lot of things for you. It's going to update the outlines based on the changes that you make to your surfaces. But the script itself does not draw the planes for you, so you're going to have to do that yourself and update it manually anytime that you make changes to the outlines. So this is going to take a little while. You need to make sure that your planes are all flat, because it's going to be important later that we have what are called developable surfaces, so nothing that has any double curvatures in it. Just meaning be careful about how you select all of your surfaces. If you have a triangular surface rather than a 4-sided surface, you just hit enter to end the command and make a surface out of 3 points rather than 4. Make sure your snaps are on so that you're snapping to endpoints of the lines. And I'm just working from bottom to top so that I can still see what I'm doing. Gets a little trickier as you get more surfaces in place. Almost done. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the outlines now so that I just have the planes. If for some reason you hadn't been managing your layers correctly and you just wanted to select the surfaces, remember that you can go into Edit, select Objects, and since you have just lines that you want on one layer and just surfaces that you want on another, you could have selected surfaces and then change their layer up in the Properties box. So I'm going to turn off my outline, so I'm just working with the surfaces. Excuse me. And then I need to start perforating those surfaces. So back into Grasshopper. Restore. I'm going to switch scripts into the surface perforation. So we're going to do a couple of things in here. I'm going to activate the perforations layer first. I'm going to select one kind of prominent surface in Rhino. We have to do this one at a time, and set one surface in Grasshopper. You can see that my perforations are squares and rather than circles. The reason that I'm going to ask you to do this is because you're going to be laser cutting these, and the amount of time that it takes a laser cutter to cut a circle is much longer than the amount of time it takes it to cut a square. And since you're going to be having a lot of perforations, it's going to help you and the laser cutter kind of get through this process. So what we need to do is, right now, if you were to scroll over to this portion of your Grasshopper script, you're going to have this circle component here. Basically all we're doing is taking the same information and plugging it into a polygon component and setting it to have 4 sides so that we can make a square based off of the center point of the divisions, which is what this previous part of the script had been doing. So to do that, you double click and type in polygon, hit OK. It's asking for a series of base planes, so we're going to use a point to set a plane. It's asking for the radius of the polygon, how far from the center to the outside of it, or from the center to the corner, and then how many segments it has. So it defaults to 6, so if we didn't update this, it's going to default to hexagons. So we need to plug the plane origin into the planes component, and you can see that it's drawing, in Rhino, you can see that it's drawing new hexagons on top of my squares. So I need to tell it that I want it to have 4 sides instead of 6. So if I double click and type in 4, it will give me a slider that automatically has that as its value. So I plug that into the number of sides, and you can see now we have basically 2 squares on top of each other. And then lastly, the radius or the distance, that's one of our input values. It's this whole size dimension down here. So you can take this panel and drag it over and up and plug it into the second component here. And then what you would need to do is take the output from this, the P, and bring it back over to the beginning where it identifies the output for the perforations. Okay, so I'm going to delete this one that I had made earlier, and so I should just have one series of polygons now. I don't want to have 2 on top of each other. I just disabled this. I right-clicked on it and clicked on Enable. You can delete it if you want. I kept it in here in case you wanted to be able to go back and play around with that. So the other inputs for this are the margin offset, which defines a minimum border distance, so that should be the same in all of your surfaces. The grid spacing, so the distance between each element. The grid rotation, so you can see that it is, the lines are at 45 degrees to the general orientation of the surface, and then the size of the opening. So if I click on any of these and change them, so if I change this to 5, you can see that my perforations get a lot bigger. If I change the offset distance to 15, you can see that my borders get a lot bigger. The grid spacing, all of these things are adjustable. I'm not entirely sure why it's set up as panels instead of sliders. So if you wanted to, you could add in some sliders. Double-click, type in slider. Double-click on the slider, set it to numeric, or integer, I'm sorry, N for integer, and then change the range to something like 25 or 50, and hit OK. And so if you set this to 15 and plug it into the same location, if you override the location in your offset, you'll now be able to slide back and forth and see the adjustments being made in real time rather than having to double click and type in. So you can do that for all of them. If you double click on the slider, you can give it a name, call it margin offsets, and hit OK. And you've basically got the same type of information in one location as opposed to what you had before. One quick note, you can accidentally add extra information in here that will make it not work correctly. So if instead of 12 I had typed in 12 and hit enter and then hit OK, all of a sudden my script isn't going to work anymore. It doesn't understand extra spaces or extra returns like that. So you have to make sure that you don't have any extra elements in there other than exactly the number. If you're working with the panels, that's another reason that the sliders are somewhat helpful, because it just gives you a straight value. You don't have to worry about syntax errors. So once you've got all of that set, you don't really have to worry about this other than to change this to a polygon rather than a circle. You can output your perforations. So if I select the curves, which are what we want at the end of the day, I'm just going to turn off the visibility of the polygon so that you can see that our curves are what is selected at the end of the day. So now they're green when I click on them. I want to bake those onto a layer that I have set up called perforations. So I'm going to hit OK. If I go into Rhino now, and again I'm going to turn off my grasshopper geometry, so I'm going to click on don't show any grasshopper geometry. If I'm in Rhino now, I have a surface and I have all of these perforations, but they're not actually perforating anything yet. So I'm going to use the split tool, S-P-L-I-T, and I want to split this surface, hit enter, and then I want to select all of these smaller outlines that are on my perforations layer. And I can do that by holding down Shift and selecting them part by part. Be careful you don't grab any extra surfaces, or I can right click and select objects and hit enter. And as soon as it finishes processing, you should be able to go in and delete all of your perforation points, or all of your perforations. And then you can go in and see that we now have holes in our surface. So you should do this one by one in terms of the surfaces. You might start setting up more layers to keep things more organized, or you can hide everything other than the surface. So if I wanted to hide everything other than this, I could click on it, hit edit, select objects, and invert, and then hide these. And you can go in Control-Shift-H and pick one surface at a time. Disregard the green stuff. We'll get to that in a minute. You can go in and pick one surface at a time to show. So I'm going to just perforate the one surface for now. You do want to make sure that it's perforated and not just a series of curves mapped onto the surface. This will help you later on, or it will be required later on. So I'm going to periodically save and remind you to periodically save. When you start getting into Grasshopper, if you make some accidental changes to some of the sliders, you could start overwhelming the image or the graphics processing capabilities of the program, and it might crash. So it's good to be saving things periodically. So once I've gone through and perforated all of my panels, I want to take all of these guys and join them together. The reason being that we're going to use Rhino to do a couple of things for us to ready this file for the laser cutter. So if we have this thing, right, and we want to laser cut it, we will talk in class about the laser cutter, but basically it's a 2D laser cutting computer numerically controlled machine. So it cuts flat surfaces, it cuts panels basically out of flat surfaces. So this is obviously a three-dimensional object, but if we want to set it up so that we can cut it on the laser cutter, we can use one of Rhino's tools to do that for us. So with your joined object selected, go in and type unroll surface, unroll SRF, and you want to make sure that you have a couple of things selected here. So I want to not explode it. I want to keep the edges that are adjacent to each other connected when possible. And I want to turn the labels on. I want to be able to know which side matches up with which. And I'll show you the difference between these. So at this moment, I'm going to hide, I'm going to hide the original surface, just so you can see. It's made a unrolled surface. Oh, it's going to unroll each of those. Oh, that's annoying. It's trying to fill in the blanks on all of these little perforations. We'll adjust for that in a little bit. But basically for now, on the ones that don't have perforations in them, you can see that it's taken the object apart and laid it down flat. And where sides match up, where you could just take a flat piece of paper and fold it up into place, it's kept those connected to each other. And where there is an angle that doesn't allow for that, it's separated them apart, but it's given you a label on each side that tells you what matches up with what. So that's not such a big deal here, but when you have 788 here, and you don't know quite where the other 788 is, it'll start to become helpful. So you can see that this would connect back on itself and make kind of a tube. So we might perforate these after we unroll them, just for simplicity's sake. Although you wouldn't be able to see them then. Okay. So for now, we're going to keep going. And I'm going to go back just for a second and unperforate this surface, and then we'll go in and do the perforations afterwards. So I'm just undoing to the point where I have not yet baked the surface. So I'm going to join it again, and I'm going to unroll surface. Explode no labels, yes. Hit enter. It's much simpler this time, and I'm going to hide the purple surface. I want my newly unrolled surface to be on the planes layer, and I'll switch the text onto a different layer in a minute. So you can see here it's a lot more simple in terms of what is shown. So I'm going to ungroup this. So now I should be able to select my text dots and my poly surfaces separately. These little items here are editable text. You can see over here in properties that it has a number in it. It's basically a tag that Rhino makes as part of the unroll command and part of some of the other commands. It's kind of a parametric text, which means that it still is editable. We're going to need to turn it into something that is object, is an outline, so that we can cut it into the surface of your kind of enclosure, so that you know which side is which even after it comes out of the laser cutter. So to do that, we want to separate the planes from the text. The easiest way to do that, these guys are still joined, so that's not a big deal, meaning that you could select all of these dots manually. You could also edit select objects, and select the surfaces, or the poly surfaces in this case. Select objects, poly surfaces, and then select objects, invert. There's no select objects for text dots, so you have to select what is not it, and then do the inverse. So I've just gone into properties with these selected. I want to put them on the text layer. So now I have my text on one layer and my surface on the other. I'm going to explode this so that I have it in individual surface segments. Okay, I'm going to pause here so that we can start a second video because we're going to get into some Rhino scripting.